Peasant woman lost her baby 17 years ago, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth. What if the child she mourned had grown up in the castle, raised as royalty, without ever knowing where he came from? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the English countryside like a shroud of forgotten memories, wrapping the small village of Thornwick in a blanket of gray dampness that seeped into every wooden beam and thatched roof. The year was one of hardship, when the common folk bent their backs to the earth and prayed for harvests that would sustain them through the brutal winters that swept down from the north. In this humble settlement, where mud-caked paths wound between simple cottages, and the acrid smell of wood smoke hung perpetually in the air, lived a woman whose beauty was as striking as it was unexpected in such harsh surroundings. Mara Thornley possessed the kind of grace that seemed entirely out of place among the weathered faces and calloused hands of peasant life. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of deep chestnut brown, catching glints of copper when the rare sunlight broke through the clouds. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of green that reminded one of forest moss after spring rain, held depths of sorrow that no woman of barely 23 summers should carry. She moved through her daily tasks with a quiet dignity, her slender frame wrapped in layers of rough-spun wool dyed in muted browns and grays, with a leather belt cinched at her waist and a simple cloak of darker fabric that she pulled tight against the morning chill. Despite the coarseness of her garments, there was something in the way she carried herself that suggested she had not always known such poverty. Mara's cottage sat at the edge of Thornwick, a small structure of timber and stone with a roof that leaked during heavy rains. She shared this meager dwelling with her elderly father, Thomas, whose mind had begun to wander in recent years, often confusing the present with memories of decades past. This particular morning, as Mara stirred the thin porridge over the hearth fire, her father sat in his wooden chair, staring into the flames with rheumy eyes that seemed to see things no longer present. "The baby cried all night," Thomas muttered, his gnarled fingers clutching the armrests of his chair. "Did you hear him, daughter? Such powerful lungs for one so small." Mara's hand trembled slightly as she continued stirring, her knuckles white against the wooden spoon. She had learned long ago not to correct her father, when his mind drifted to that terrible night 17 years ago, the night that had shattered her world into pieces that could never be reassembled. Instead, she simply nodded, her throat tight with the familiar ache of loss that never truly faded, merely dulled with the passage of time. "Yes, father," she said softly, her voice carrying the melodic quality that had once attracted the attention of a young merchant's son, before everything had fallen apart. "I heard him." The porridge bubbled and spat, and Mara ladled it into 2 wooden bowls, adding a precious pinch of salt to each. As she brought the meager breakfast to the rough-hewn table, a sharp knock at the door made her start, nearly spilling the hot contents. Visitors were rare in Thornwick, and those who came seldom brought good news. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to open the door, her heart already beginning to race with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed entirely incongruous with the humble surroundings. The man was tall and powerfully built, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of deep blue wool lined with gray fur, clasped at his throat with a silver brooch worked in intricate designs. Beneath the cloak, he wore a leather jerkin over a tunic of fine weave with sturdy boots that rose to his knees and showed the quality craftsmanship rarely seen outside the larger towns. His face was striking, with strong features that spoke of both nobility and hard living, a square jaw shadowed with several days' growth of dark beard, and eyes of piercing blue that seemed to take in everything at once. His hair, nearly black and slightly too long, was pushed back from his forehead, revealing a small scar above his left eyebrow. "Mistress Thornley?" the man asked, his voice deep and cultured, bearing the accent of someone educated far beyond the village schools. "Forgive the intrusion at such an early hour. My name is Captain Garrett Blackwood, and I serve in the Royal Guard of King Harold. I have traveled from the capital with a matter of grave importance to discuss with you." Mara felt the blood drain from her face, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. The Royal Guard. After 17 years of silence, of forced forgetting, of building walls around her heart so high that nothing could penetrate them, here stood a representative of the very power that had destroyed her life. She wanted to slam the door, to refuse him entry, to scream that she had nothing to say to anyone connected with the crown. But years of conditioning, of knowing that peasants did not refuse the requests of those in authority, held her tongue. "What could the royal guard possibly want with a poor weaver's daughter?" she managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady despite the tumult inside her chest. Garrett Blackwood's expression softened slightly, and he glanced past her into the cottage, noting the sparse furnishings and the old man sitting by the fire. "It is a delicate matter, Mistress Thornley, one that would be better discussed in private. I assure you, I mean you no harm. Quite the contrary, in fact. The information I bring may be of considerable interest to you." Against her better judgment, Mara stepped aside and allowed him to enter. The cottage seemed to shrink with his presence, his height forcing him to duck beneath the low doorway, and his broad frame making the small space feel even more cramped. He removed his cloak with practiced ease, folding it carefully over his arm, and waited for her invitation to sit. The courtesy surprised her. Nobles and their servants rarely bothered with such niceties when dealing with peasants. "Please," she gestured to the bench near the table, then moved to check on her father, who had not even looked up at the visitor's arrival, still lost in whatever memories held him captive. She poured a cup of weak ale from the jug on the shelf and placed it before Captain Blackwood, then seated herself across from him, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. Garrett Blackwood took a measured sip of the ale, his eyes never leaving her face, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Mistress Thornley, what I am about to tell you may come as a shock, and for that I apologize in advance. But it is my duty to inform you of recent discoveries that have come to light within the royal household. I cannot imagine what discoveries in the king's palace could possibly involve me," Mara said, though her heart was beating so hard she feared he might hear it. "I am nobody, just a peasant woman who weaves cloth and tends to her aging father." "That may be true now," Garrett replied, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on his thighs as he fixed her with those penetrating blue eyes. "But 17 years ago you were a young woman who gave birth to a son who was stolen from you in the night, taken from your arms while you slept, leaving you to wake to an empty cradle and a grief that has clearly never left you." The words hit Mara like physical blows, and she felt the room begin to spin around her. Her hands flew to her mouth, and she had to fight against the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. How could this stranger know about that night? How could he speak so casually of the event that had destroyed her, that had driven her from her home in shame, that had left her hollow and broken for years afterward? "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice raw with sudden fury. "How dare you come into my home and speak of things you know nothing about? You have no right, no authority, to dredge up pain that I have spent years trying to bury." "I understand your anger," Garrett said calmly, making no move to defend himself or to leave despite the venom in her words. "But please, Mistress Thornley, hear me out. The child who was taken from you that night did not die, as you may have feared. He lived. He was brought to the capital, presented to the royal family under circumstances that were, at the time, accepted without question. That child, your son, has been raised as Prince Alexander, heir to the throne of England." The silence that followed his words was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Thomas's occasional mumbling. Mara stared at Captain Blackwood as if he had suddenly begun speaking a foreign tongue, her mind unable to process what he had just said. Prince Alexander. The name was known throughout the kingdom, the young heir who had been born to the queen in what had been described as a difficult labor, the child who would one day rule over all of England. But that child was not the queen's son. According to this man, that child was hers. "That's impossible," she finally managed to say, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "The prince was born to Queen Margaret. The entire kingdom celebrated his birth. There were proclamations, festivals. You're telling me lies, cruel lies designed to torment me for some purpose I cannot fathom." Garrett reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table between them and carefully unfolded the fabric, revealing a tiny silver pendant in the shape of a crescent moon, no larger than a thumbnail, suspended on a delicate chain. Mara felt her breath catch in her throat. She recognized that pendant. It had been her mother's, passed down through 3 generations, and she had placed it around her newborn son's neck mere hours after his birth, a blessing for protection and good fortune. This was found among Prince Alexander's belongings, Garrett explained, his voice gentle now, as if he understood the magnitude of what this revelation meant. The Queen's physician, a man named Dr. Aldrich, confessed on his deathbed 3 weeks ago to a terrible crime. He had been bribed by certain members of the nobility to substitute the Queen's stillborn child with a healthy infant, one who could ensure the continuation of the royal line. Queen Margaret never knew. She was heavily sedated during the birth and told afterward that she had delivered a living son. The king, desperate for an heir and unaware of the deception, accepted the child as his own. Mara reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the pendant, the silver warm against her skin despite the chill of the morning. Tears began to stream down her face, silent at first, then accompanied by great shaking sobs that seemed to tear themselves from the very depths of her soul. All these years of grief and guilt, of wondering if her son had suffered, if he had died alone and afraid, if she could have done something differently to protect him. And all along he had been alive, raised in luxury and privilege, while she had scraped by in poverty, her heart a constant open wound that never healed. "Why?" she choked out between sobs. "Why are you telling me this now? What purpose does it serve to reopen wounds that time has barely begun to close? Do you expect me to do something with this information? To march to the capital and demand my son be returned to me? I have nothing, Captain Blackwood." Nothing to offer him. No proof beyond this pendant that could be dismissed as coincidence or theft. "The proof exists," Garrett assured her, his expression one of genuine sympathy. Dr. Aldrich kept detailed records of the exchange, including the names of those who paid him to commit this act. The documents have been examined by the king's most trusted advisors, and there is no doubt as to their authenticity. Your son's true identity is not in question. What happens next, however, is far more complicated. He paused, taking another sip of the ale before continuing. "King Harold is gravely ill. He has perhaps a few months remaining, and he wishes to see justice done before he passes. However, revealing the truth publicly would throw the kingdom into chaos. There are factions at court who would use this scandal to seize power, who would see the kingdom torn apart by civil war, rather than accept a prince whose blood is common rather than royal. The king wishes to meet you, Mistress Thornley, to hear your story, and to determine the best course of action for all involved, including your son." Mara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some measure of composure. Her mind was racing, spinning through possibilities and implications faster than she could process them. And what of Alexander? Does he know? Does he know that the woman he believes to be his mother is not, that his entire life has been built on a lie? "He does not know," Garrett admitted. The king felt it would be too cruel to burden him with this knowledge before understanding the full situation. "Prince Alexander is a good man, Mistress Thornley. He is educated, skilled in combat, beloved by those who know him. He takes his responsibilities seriously and has been raised to rule with justice and compassion. But he deserves to know the truth of his birth, and you deserve the chance to know the son who was stolen from you." "When?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When does the king wish to see me?" "I have been instructed to escort you to the capital with all haste," Garrett replied. "The journey will take several days on horseback. I have brought provisions and an extra mount. I understand that this is overwhelming, and if you need time to consider, I can wait. But the king's time is limited, and every day we delay is a day he grows weaker." Mara looked around her cottage, at the simple life she had built from the ruins of her shattered dreams. She thought of her father, whose care would need to be arranged. She thought of the loom in the corner where she had spent countless hours weaving cloth to sell at market, the monotonous work that had kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on her loss. And she thought of the baby she had held for such a brief time, the son whose face she could no longer clearly remember, who had grown into a man without her. "I will need to make arrangements for my father's care," she said finally, straightening her shoulders and meeting Garrett's gaze with a newfound determination. "There is a neighbor, Widow Harriet, who has often helped me. She will look after him while I am gone." "Give me until tomorrow morning to set my affairs in order, Captain Blackwood. Then I will accompany you to the capital." Garrett Blackwood nodded, rising from the bench with fluid grace despite his size. "I will secure lodging at the village inn and return at first light. Thank you, Mistress Thornley, for your courage. I know this cannot be easy for you." After he left, Mara sat alone in the cottage, the silver pendant clutched tightly in her hand, pressing into her palm until it left an impression on her skin. Her father had fallen asleep in his chair, his breathing raspy but steady. She thought about the journey ahead, about what it would mean to see her son again after all these years. Would he look like her? Would there be any recognition, any connection between them despite the years and circumstances that had separated them? And what of her own feelings? Could she truly claim him as her own after he had been raised by others, shaped by a life she could never have provided? As the day wore on, Mara made her preparations with mechanical efficiency, her mind still reeling from the morning's revelations. She spoke with Widow Harriet, who agreed without hesitation to care for Thomas, clucking her tongue sympathetically when Mara explained, in vague terms, that she needed to travel on urgent family business. She packed a small bag with her few possessions, including the pendant that had been returned to her. She mended her best dress, such as it was, and attempted to make herself presentable for an audience with the king, though she knew her peasant clothing would mark her as an outsider in the refined world of the royal court. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She lay on her straw mattress, staring at the darkened ceiling, and allowed herself to remember things she had forbidden herself to think about for 17 years. The feeling of her baby's weight in her arms, the sweet smell of his skin, the way his tiny fingers had wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength. The joy she had felt, despite her circumstances, despite knowing that she would face scorn and hardship as an unwed mother. And then the devastating awakening, the empty cradle, the frantic search, the growing horror as hours became days with no sign of her missing child. She had been accused of infanticide by some villagers, of selling her baby to traveling merchants by others. The truth that he had simply vanished had been too strange, too inexplicable for most to accept. Eventually the accusations had died down, but the stigma had remained, and she had moved to Thornwick to escape the whispers and pointing fingers. Here, she had told no one of her past, content to be known simply as a quiet woman who kept to herself and did honest work. But now, everything was about to change. As dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mara rose and dressed in her traveling clothes, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. She heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and knew that Captain Blackwood had arrived as promised. She kissed her sleeping father's forehead, whispering a promise that she would return to him, and stepped out into the cool morning air to face whatever destiny awaited her in the capital. The journey to the capital began under skies that threatened rain, but held back their burden, as if the heavens themselves were waiting to see how this strange pilgrimage would unfold. Mara had never ridden a horse before, and the mare that Captain Blackwood had brought for her was a gentle creature with a coat the color of chestnuts and a patient temperament that seemed to sense her rider's inexperience. Garrett had helped her mount with a courtesy that surprised her, his strong hands steadying her as she awkwardly settled into the saddle, her legs already protesting the unfamiliar position. They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving Thornwick behind as the village disappeared into the morning mist. The road stretched before them, a muddy track that wound through fields where peasants were already bent to their labor, their forms dark against the pale earth. Mara kept her eyes forward, her hands gripping the reins so tightly that her knuckles turned white, trying to find a rhythm with the horse's movement that would make the journey less jarring to her unaccustomed body. "You ride well for someone who has never sat a horse," Garrett said eventually, breaking the silence between them. He rode beside her on a powerful black stallion that seemed almost an extension of himself, his posture relaxed and confident in the saddle. "Most first-time riders are far more tense. You have a natural balance." "I am too terrified to be anything but rigid," Mara replied, attempting a smile that felt shaky on her lips. "If I relax, I fear I will simply slide off onto the road and you will have to scrape me from the mud." Garrett's laugh was rich and genuine, transforming his serious face into something more approachable. "I promise that will not happen. Your mare, Roslyn, is the gentlest mount in the royal stables. She has carried children and elderly nobles alike without incident. Trust her, and trust yourself." As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mara did begin to relax slightly, her body adapting to the horse's rhythm. They passed through small hamlets and larger villages, each one a collection of timber and stone buildings with thatched roofs, where curious faces appeared in doorways and windows to watch the travelers pass. Mara noticed how people's expressions changed when they saw Garrett's fine clothing and the sword that hung at his side. Respect mixed with wariness, the common folk's instinctive reaction to those who held power over their lives. During a rest stop near a stream where they allowed the horses to drink, Garrett unpacked provisions from his saddlebags. Fresh bread, hard cheese, dried meat, and a skin of wine far superior to anything Mara had tasted in years. They sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, and as they ate, Mara found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. He moved with the confidence of a warrior, yet there was a thoughtfulness in his eyes that suggested he was more than just a soldier following orders. "How did you come to be part of this secret, Captain Blackwood?" she asked, tearing off a piece of bread and chewing it slowly. "Surely the king does not share such dangerous information with just anyone in his guard." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stream where the water tumbled over smooth stones. "I have served King Harold for 12 years, since I was 17. He took me into his personal guard after I saved his life during a hunting accident. Over the years, I have become not just his protector, but, I dare to hope, his friend and confidant. When Dr. Aldrich made his deathbed confession, the king needed someone he could trust absolutely to investigate the claims, and if they proved true, to find you. That responsibility fell to me. And what do you think of all this?" Mara pressed, genuinely curious. "Do you believe a peasant woman's son has the right to rule over nobles and knights? Does it not offend your sense of order to know that your future king's blood is common?" Garrett turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes intense and sincere. "I think that a man's character matters far more than the circumstances of his birth. I have known Prince Alexander since he was a boy, and I can tell you without hesitation that he is the finest man I have ever had the honor to serve. If anything, knowing that he carries the blood of those who work the land and understand true hardship makes me respect him more, not less. The nobility have forgotten what it means to struggle, to sacrifice. Perhaps having a king who knows that struggle, even if he does not remember it, will be exactly what this kingdom needs." His words moved something in Mara's chest, a feeling she could not quite name. Here was a man of obvious breeding and education, a captain in the royal guard, speaking of her son with genuine admiration and defending the worth of common blood. It was so contrary to everything she had experienced in her interactions with the nobility, who had treated her like dirt beneath their boots when they bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. "Tell me about him," she said softly, setting aside her food as her appetite was suddenly overcome by her hunger for knowledge of her son. "Tell me about Alexander. What kind of man has he become?" Garrett's expression softened, and he seemed to relax further as he spoke. "Prince Alexander is 24 now, though he will turn 25 in the autumn. He is tall, nearly as tall as I am, with broad shoulders and the build of a warrior. He has trained with the sword since he was old enough to hold one, and he is formidable in combat, though he takes no pleasure in violence. His hair is dark, like rich earth after rain, and his eyes are green, remarkably green, the color of new leaves in spring." Mara's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Green eyes, her eyes. The one feature she remembered clearly from that brief time with her baby was his eyes, which had opened once to look at her with that unfocused gaze of newborns, showing the green that would deepen with age. "He loves learning," Garrett continued, not seeming to notice her emotional reaction or politely ignoring it. "His chambers are filled with books and maps. He speaks 4 languages fluently and can read Latin and Greek. He is kind to the servants, remembers their names, and asks after their families. He rides through the city streets without armed escort, stopping to speak with merchants and craftsmen, genuinely interested in their lives and concerns. The people love him for it, though it gives his guards constant anxiety." "He sounds wonderful," Mara whispered, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. "Nothing like what I could have given him." "Perhaps it is better that he was taken, that he had the chance to become this man you describe, rather than the struggling peasant he would have been with me. Do not diminish yourself, Mistress Thornley," Garrett said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "The character that Alexander displays, his compassion and his sense of justice, those things do not come from fine clothes and expensive tutors alone. They come from something innate, something he was born with, something he inherited from you." They resumed their journey after the brief rest, and as the hours passed, Mara found herself drawn into conversation with Garrett more readily than she had with anyone in years. He told her stories of life at court, the intricate dances of politics and power, the alliances and betrayals that happened beneath the surface of polite society. He spoke of battles he had fought, of lands he had seen, of the weight of responsibility that came with protecting not just a king, but an entire kingdom's future. In turn, and to her own surprise, Mara found herself sharing pieces of her own story that she had kept locked away for so long. She told him about her mother, who had died when Mara was 16, leaving her alone with a father whose mind was already beginning to fail. She spoke of the merchant's son who had courted her, who had promised her marriage, and then disappeared when she told him she was with child, leaving her to face the consequences alone. She described the night her baby was taken, the emptiness that had followed, the years of grief and survival. Garrett listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful and sympathetic. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in many years. She found herself noticing small things about him, the way his hands were both strong and gentle on the reins, the small scar above his eyebrow that gave his handsome face character, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. He was perhaps 30 years of age, she guessed, in the prime of his life and strength, and there was an integrity about him that she could not help but admire. By the time they stopped for the night at a small inn along the road, Mara's body ached in places she had not known could ache, her thighs and back protesting the long hours in the saddle. Garrett secured 2 rooms for them, handling the arrangements with efficiency, while Mara waited in the common room, acutely aware of how out of place she looked among the travelers and merchants who filled the space. Her peasant clothing marked her clearly, and she saw the curious glances, the whispered questions about who she might be and why she traveled with a captain of the royal guard. In her room, small but clean, with a proper bed rather than a straw mattress, Mara lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress and allowed herself a moment of weakness. She buried her face in her hands and let the tears come, all the emotions she had been holding back throughout the day overwhelming her at once. Joy that her son lived, grief for the years lost, fear of what would happen when they reached the capital, uncertainty about whether she had any right to disrupt Alexander's life with the truth of his birth. A soft knock at her door interrupted her crying, and she hastily wiped her face before calling out permission to enter. Garrett stood in the doorway, his expression concerned, holding a tray with a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a cup of wine. "I thought you might prefer to eat in your room rather than face the crowds downstairs," he said, entering when she nodded and setting the tray on the small table near the window. "The journey has been hard on you, and you need rest." "Thank you," Mara said, her voice rough from crying. "You are very kind, Captain Blackwood. Far kinder than I would have expected from someone in your position." "My position?" Garrett raised an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from where she sat. "And what position is that? A noble, a warrior, someone who serves kings and mingles with the highest in the land?" Mara replied, "Such men rarely show consideration for peasant women. We are beneath their notice, or we are merely obstacles to be moved aside." "Then you have known the wrong sort of men," Garrett said quietly. "Birth does not determine worth, Mistress Thornley. I have known nobles with hearts blacker than pitch, and peasants with integrity that would shame kings. You have suffered a terrible injustice, and you have survived with your dignity intact. That commands my respect, regardless of the circumstances of your birth or mine." They talked late into the night, long after Mara had finished her meal. Garrett told her more about what to expect when they reached the capital, about the protocol of the court, about the king's illness and how it had weakened him but not his mind or his determination to see justice done. He prepared her as best he could for the shock of the royal palace, the overwhelming grandeur that would be so foreign to someone who had lived her entire life in small villages and humble cottages. As Garrett finally rose to leave, pausing at the door to wish her good night, Mara felt an unexpected reluctance to see him go. His presence had become a comfort, an anchor in the storm of uncertainty that threatened to sweep her away. She realized with a start that she had not felt this way about anyone since the merchant's son had betrayed her trust all those years ago. It was dangerous, she told herself, to develop feelings for a man so far above her station, a man who was merely doing his duty in escorting her to the capital. Yet she could not deny the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled at her, or the way her heart beat faster when their hands accidentally touched. The next 3 days of travel followed a similar pattern. They rose early, rode long hours with stops for rest and meals, and spent evenings at inns along the road, talking and learning about each other in ways that seemed to transcend their different stations in life. Mara's riding improved with each passing day, her body adapting to the demands of the journey, and she found herself actually enjoying the sensation of movement, the freedom of traveling beyond the narrow confines of the village where she had spent so many years. Garrett proved to be an excellent teacher, showing her how to guide her horse with gentle pressure rather than harsh pulls on the reins, how to post in the saddle to ease the jarring of the trot, how to read the horse's mood and respond accordingly. He was patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she mastered something new. More than once, Mara caught herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, admiring the way he sat his horse with such effortless grace, the strength evident in his frame, the intelligence that shone in his eyes when they discussed matters of importance. On the 4th evening, as they crested a hill and the capital city spread out before them in the valley below, Mara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never seen anything like it. The city was enormous, a sprawling collection of buildings that seemed to go on forever, surrounded by high stone walls with towers at regular intervals. At the center, dominating the skyline, was the royal palace, a massive structure of gray stone with multiple towers and battlements, banners flying from its heights bearing the king's colors. "It is overwhelming, is it not?" Garrett said softly, bringing his horse alongside hers. "The first time I saw it, I was a boy of 12, arriving with my father for his investiture as a knight. I remember thinking that surely the entire world could fit within those walls. How do people live in such a place?" Mara wondered aloud. "So many souls crowded together, so much stone and so little earth. Where do they grow their food? Where do their children play?" "The city has its own rhythm," Garrett explained. "Markets and trade, craftsmen and guilds, nobility and commoners all living in their separate but interconnected worlds. It is loud and dirty and beautiful and terrible all at once, but it is also where your son lives, where he has grown from a baby into the man he is today. Tomorrow you will enter those walls and your life will change forever." That night, at the finest inn Mara had ever seen, located just outside the city walls, she could not sleep. She stood at the window of her room, looking out at the city lights that flickered in the darkness like earthbound stars, and tried to prepare herself mentally for what was to come. In the morning, she would meet the king. She would learn more about the plot that had stolen her child. And perhaps, if the king deemed it appropriate, she would meet Alexander himself. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. What would she say to him? How could she possibly explain who she was and what she meant to him without destroying the world he had known? And what if he rejected her? What if he saw her common blood as a stain on his royal identity, rather than a connection to be embraced? These questions spun through her mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind, giving her no peace. Just before dawn, there was another knock at her door, and when she opened it, she found Garrett standing there with a bundle of cloth in his arms. His expression was serious but not unkind as he entered at her invitation and laid the bundle on the bed. "I took the liberty of having these made for you," he said, unfolding the cloth to reveal a dress far finer than anything Mara had ever owned. It was made of deep blue wool, similar in color to Garrett's cloak, with long fitted sleeves and a bodice that laced up the front. There was a leather belt worked with subtle designs, and a cloak of gray lined with soft fur. "You cannot meet the king in peasant garb. It would be seen as disrespectful, even though you have no fine clothes of your own. Please accept these as a gift. They are not royal finery, but they are appropriate for someone of middle station, and they will help you feel less out of place in the palace." Mara ran her fingers over the fabric, marveling at its softness and quality. Tears pricked her eyes once again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. "Captain Blackwood, I do not know how to thank you. You have shown me such kindness throughout this journey. I do not understand why you would go to such trouble for someone like me." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate than it had been. "I think you underestimate yourself, Mistress Thornley. You are brave and resilient, intelligent and kind. Any man would consider it an honor to assist you. I know I do." Their eyes met, and Mara felt something pass between them, an understanding that went beyond words. She saw in his gaze something she had not expected, something that both thrilled and frightened her, admiration, respect, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginnings of something deeper. Before she could examine the feeling too closely or respond to it, Garrett cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the moment. "I will wait for you downstairs," he said, his voice returning to its normal professional tone. "Take your time dressing. When you are ready, we will proceed to the palace." The palace gates rose before them like the entrance to another world. Massive iron-wrought barriers set within stone archways that had stood for centuries, bearing witness to the rise and fall of dynasties. Guards in polished armor stood at attention, their breastplates catching the morning sun and reflecting it in blinding flashes of light. As Garrett approached on his black stallion, with Mara following close behind on Roslyn, the guards immediately straightened and offered sharp salutes, recognizing the captain despite his several days' absence from the capital. "Captain Blackwood," the senior guard acknowledged, his weathered face breaking into a slight smile. "Welcome back. The king has been asking after you daily. He will be pleased to know you have returned safely." "Thank you, Marcus," Garrett replied with easy familiarity. "Please send word to Lord Chancellor Pembroke that I have arrived and request an immediate audience with His Majesty. Tell him the matter we discussed before my departure has been resolved successfully." The guard's eyes flickered briefly to Mara, curiosity evident in his gaze, but years of training kept him from asking questions. He simply nodded and gestured for one of the younger guards to run ahead with the message while the gates were drawn open with a great groaning of metal and wood. Mara's hands tightened on her reins as they passed through the gateway into the palace grounds, entering a courtyard so vast that her entire village of Thornwick could have fit within it with room to spare. The courtyard was a hive of activity despite the early hour. Servants hurried about their duties carrying baskets of linens and trays of food. Stable boys rushed forward to take the horses as Garrett and Mara dismounted. Knights in training practiced their swordplay in a designated area, the clash of steel on steel ringing out across the stones. Ladies in fine dresses walked arm in arm through manicured gardens, their laughter like the tinkling of bells. Everywhere Mara looked, she saw wealth and refinement that seemed almost obscene in its abundance when she thought of the struggling peasants she had left behind in the countryside. Garrett helped her down from her horse with steady hands, and she was grateful for his support as her legs trembled beneath her, whether from the long ride or from sheer nervousness she could not say. The dress he had given her was beautiful and well-fitted, making her feel slightly less conspicuous among all this grandeur, though she still felt like an imposter playing at being something she was not. Her chestnut hair, which she had braided carefully that morning, felt inadequate compared to the elaborate styles she saw on the noble ladies around her. "Stay close to me," Garrett murmured, offering her his arm in a gesture that was both protective and courteous. "The palace can be overwhelming for those unfamiliar with it. Trust me to guide you, and do not let the stares and whispers trouble you. Curiosity is natural, but no one will dare approach or question you while you are under my protection." Indeed, as they made their way across the courtyard toward the main entrance of the palace, Mara was acutely aware of the attention they drew. Nobles and servants alike paused in their activities to watch the captain of the guard escorting an unknown woman through the grounds. She heard whispers following in their wake, speculation about who she might be and what business she had within the palace walls. She kept her head high and her eyes forward, drawing on reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed. The interior of the palace exceeded even the grandeur of the courtyard. They entered through doors of carved oak banded with iron, passing into a great hall where the ceiling soared so high above that Mara felt dizzy looking up at it. Tapestries depicting battle scenes and royal lineages hung from the stone walls, each one worth more than everything she had ever owned in her entire life. The floor was polished stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and torches and iron sconces provided light even though windows set high in the walls allowed sunlight to stream through. Garrett led her through a maze of corridors, each one seemingly more opulent than the last, until they reached a smaller, more intimate chamber, where a thin, scholarly-looking man in his 50s waited. He wore robes of dark green trimmed with silver thread, and his gray hair was neatly trimmed. His sharp eyes assessed Mara with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, but when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Captain Blackwood, I see your journey was successful. This must be Mistress Thornley." The man bowed slightly to Mara, a gesture of respect that shocked her coming from someone who was clearly high-ranking. "I am Lord Chancellor Pembroke, Chief Advisor to King Harold." His Majesty has been anxiously awaiting your arrival. How is the king's health, my lord? Garrett asked, his voice tight with concern. Pembroke's expression grew somber. He weakens daily, I am afraid. The physicians say it is only a matter of weeks now, perhaps a month if we are fortunate. But his mind remains sharp, and his determination to resolve this matter has not wavered. He insists on seeing Mistress Thornley immediately, despite the toll such a meeting will take on his limited strength. Then we should not keep him waiting, Garrett said. Though Mara noticed, he squeezed her arm gently, offering silent support. They climbed a spiral staircase to the upper levels of the palace, where the king's private chambers were located. Guards stood at every turn, their eyes watchful and hands never far from their weapons. Finally, they reached a set of double doors carved with the royal coat of arms, where 2 guards stood at attention. At a nod from Pembroke, the doors were opened, and Mara found herself being ushered into the presence of the king himself. The room was warm, heated by a large fireplace, and filled with the scent of herbs that had been burned to mask the smell of sickness. Heavy curtains had been drawn back from the windows to allow in light, illuminating a chamber that was surprisingly modest compared to the rest of the palace. The furniture was fine but not ostentatious, and there were personal touches everywhere. Books stacked on tables, a chess set mid-game, a child's drawing pinned to the wall that must have been decades old. In a chair near the window, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the room, sat King Harold. He had once been a large man. Mara could see that in the breadth of his shoulders and the size of his frame, but illness had wasted him until his skin seemed to hang from his bones. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but those eyes still held a fierce intelligence and an unmistakable authority. His hair, once dark, was now completely white, and his hands, folded on the blanket across his lap, trembled slightly with the palsy of the very sick. "Your Majesty," Garrett said, bowing deeply, and Mara hastily followed suit, dropping into an awkward curtsy that she hoped was appropriate. "Garrett, my boy." The king's voice was weak but warm. "You have returned to me safely, thank God, and this must be Mistress Mara Thornley. Please, child, come closer so these old eyes can see you properly." Mara approached on shaking legs, hardly able to believe she was standing in the presence of the King of England, the man who ruled over all the lands she had ever known, and many more besides. She stopped a respectful distance from his chair, unsure of what to say or do, feeling completely out of her depth. King Harold studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then something shifted in his features, a softening that might have been recognition or perhaps regret. "You have beautiful eyes, Mistress Thornley, green as the forests of my youth. Alexander has the same eyes. I should have noticed before, should have questioned. But I was desperate for an heir, you understand. My queen had lost 3 babies before Alexander's birth, and I could not bear to see her suffer another loss. When they told me she had delivered a healthy son, I did not look closely. I did not ask the questions I should have asked. For that, I am deeply sorry. Your Majesty, I do not understand what you hope to accomplish by bringing me here," Mara said, finding her voice despite her nervousness. "The past cannot be changed. My son has been raised as your heir, and he knows no other life. What purpose does it serve to disrupt everything now, when you are so close to passing the crown to him? The purpose is truth," King Harold said firmly, his voice gaining strength from passion, if not from health. "I will not die with this lie unresolved. Alexander deserves to know who he truly is, where he came from, and you deserve acknowledgement of what was stolen from you. But more than that, this kingdom deserves a king who understands his people, who knows what it means to struggle and suffer. That knowledge cannot come from books and tutors alone. It must be in the blood, in the bone. Alexander has that, whether he knows it or not." "But revealing the truth could destroy him," Mara protested, thinking of what Garrett had told her about her son's character. "He has built his entire identity around being your son, Your Majesty. How can you ask him to abandon that? How can you ask me to be the instrument of his pain?" "I am not asking you to abandon him to that pain," the king replied. "I am asking you to be there to help him through it. You are his mother, Mistress Thornley. That bond exists, whether you have been present in his life or not. He will need you in the difficult days ahead, need your strength and your honesty." Lord Chancellor Pembroke stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "If I may, Your Majesty, perhaps we should explain to Mistress Thornley the full scope of the situation. She deserves to understand everything before decisions are made about how to proceed. King Harold nodded wearily, and Pembroke turned to address Mara directly. The conspiracy that resulted in your child being taken was not a simple crime of opportunity. It was orchestrated by a faction within the nobility led by Duke Ravencrest, a man who has long coveted the throne for his own bloodline. When Queen Margaret's child was stillborn, Ravencrest saw an opportunity. He arranged for a healthy peasant baby to be substituted, knowing that if the truth ever came out, the scandal would be enough to destabilize the monarchy and allow him to seize power. But why would the physician agree to such a thing? Mara asked, struggling to understand the complex politics at play. Money, primarily, Pembroke replied. Dr. Aldrich was deeply in debt due to gambling. Ravencrest paid those debts and promised him a position of great influence in the new regime. What Aldrich did not anticipate was that he would be consumed by guilt for 17 years, that the weight of his crime would become unbearable. His deathbed confession was not motivated by nobility, but by a desperate desire for absolution before facing his maker. Duke Ravencrest still does not know that his plot has been discovered, King Harold added. He believes the secret died with Dr. Aldrich, that he is safe to continue his machinations. But I have been gathering evidence against him, building a case that will not only expose his role in the abduction, but also reveal a dozen other crimes he has committed over the years. When Alexander takes the throne, one of his first acts will be to bring Ravencrest to justice. And what of the Queen? Mara asked softly. Does she know the truth about Alexander? A shadow of profound sadness crossed the king's face. Margaret died 5 years ago from a fever. She went to her grave believing Alexander was the son of her body. In her final days, she made me promise to care for him, to prepare him to be a good king. I intend to keep that promise, Mistress Thornley, but in a way she could never have imagined. The truth of his birth does not change the fact that she loved him as her own, raised him with all the devotion of a true mother. That legacy remains untainted. The door to the chamber opened suddenly, and Mara's heart leaped into her throat as a young man entered, clearly having been summoned. He was tall and powerfully built, his broad shoulders filling out a tunic of deep burgundy leather over a shirt of cream-colored linen. His hair was indeed dark, falling in waves to his collar, and when he turned to face them, Mara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. His eyes were green, the exact shade of her own, set in a face that was heartbreakingly handsome with strong features that held both strength and kindness. This was her son. This was Alexander. Father, Lord Pembroke said you needed to see me urgently, Alexander said, his voice deep and resonant. Then his gaze fell upon Mara, and confusion flickered across his face. Forgive me. I did not realize you had guests. I can return later if this is a private matter. No, Alexander, King Harold said, gesturing weakly for his son to come closer. This concerns you directly. Please, sit down. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I need you to listen carefully and know that everything I say comes from love and a desire for truth. Alexander moved to take a seat near his father, his movements graceful despite his size, and his eyes kept returning to Mara with barely concealed curiosity. She could not look away from him, drinking in every detail of his face, seeing echoes of herself in the shape of his nose, the curve of his mouth, the intelligence in those green eyes. This was the baby she had held for such a brief time, now grown into a man of substance and character. Alexander, the king began, his voice heavy with emotion, I have learned something that changes everything we thought we knew about your birth. The woman standing before you is Mistress Mara Thornley. She is a peasant from a small village, a weaver's daughter who lived a quiet life until 17 years ago when tragedy struck her. She gave birth to a son, a healthy baby boy with green eyes, and on the night of his birth, that child was stolen from her, taken by conspirators who intended to use him to secure the throne for themselves by substituting him for the queen's stillborn baby. The color drained from Alexander's face as understanding began to dawn. No, he said, the word barely a whisper. That is not possible. You are my father. The queen was my mother. I remember her love. This is some kind of mistake, some terrible error. There is no error, King Harold said gently but firmly. Dr. Aldrich confessed everything before he died. The records exist. The evidence is irrefutable. You are the son of Mara Thornley, taken from her and raised as mine. I loved you no less for it, Alexander. You have been my son in every way that matters, but the blood that runs in your veins is hers, not mine, and she deserves to be acknowledged for that, deserves the chance to know the man her baby became. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His face cycled through emotions too quickly to follow. Shock, denial, anger, confusion, and beneath it all, a pain so profound that Mara felt it like a physical blow. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the moment when he recognized the truth in her eyes, the shared color that could not be denied. "This is why you have green eyes," he said, his voice rough. "Everyone always commented on them, said they were unusual in the royal line. I thought they came from some distant ancestor, some great-grandmother whose portrait hangs in the gallery. But they came from you. I am so sorry," Mara said, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted to cause you pain. I did not ask for any of this. I would have been content never knowing what became of you, if it meant you could live your life without this burden. But the truth exists whether we acknowledge it or not, and now we must both find a way to live with it." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths, and then he turned and strode from the room without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like a rejection. Mara felt her legs give way, and suddenly Garrett was there, catching her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her weight as sobs racked her body. "Give him time," King Harold said softly, his own voice thick with unshed tears. "This is a shock that would break a lesser man, but Alexander is strong, stronger than even he knows. He will come to terms with the truth, and when he does, he will need you both. Garrett, see that Mistress Thornley is given appropriate quarters here in the palace. She is not to leave until this matter is resolved. She is under my personal protection, and I want it known that anyone who offers her disrespect or harm will answer to me directly, illness or no illness." The chambers assigned to Mara were far grander than anything she had ever imagined, let alone occupied. Located in the eastern wing of the palace, the suite consisted of 3 rooms, a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in burgundy velvet, a sitting room with cushioned chairs arranged near a fireplace, and a small private bathing chamber with a copper tub that servants could fill with heated water. Windows overlooked the palace gardens, where carefully tended roses bloomed despite the approaching autumn, their colors vivid against the manicured green lawns. Mara stood at one of those windows now, 3 days after her devastating meeting with Alexander, watching the sun set over the capital city. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and indifferent to the turmoil in her heart. She had not seen her son since that terrible moment when he had walked out of the king's chambers, had not received any message from him or indication that he wished to speak with her. The waiting was torture, worse in some ways than the years of not knowing whether he lived or died, because now she knew he was so close and yet completely unreachable. Garrett had visited her daily, bringing news from the court and checking on her well-being with a concern that went beyond mere duty. He had arranged for fine dresses to be made for her, had ensured she was treated with respect by the palace staff, had even taken meals with her in her chambers when the prospect of dining in the great hall seemed too overwhelming. His presence had become essential to her, a lifeline in this strange new world where she did not belong but could not leave. This evening, as the last light faded from the sky, there was a familiar knock at her door, and Mara called out permission to enter, expecting Garrett with the evening meal and his usual gentle conversation. Instead, when she turned from the window, she found Alexander standing in her doorway, still dressed in his training clothes, leather breeches, boots, and a simple linen shirt darkened with sweat. His hair was damp and pushed back from his face, and there was a bruise forming on his left cheekbone that suggested he had been working out his frustrations in the practice yard. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the emotion that must be churning beneath the surface. "Of course," Mara managed to say, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Please sit. I can call for refreshments if you wish." "That is not necessary," Alexander said, entering and closing the door behind him. He did not sit, instead moving to stand near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as he stared into the flames that had been lit against the evening chill. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things that needed to be said and the difficulty of knowing where to begin. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice low and controlled. I have spent the past 3 days trying to reconcile what I have been told with everything I believe to be true about myself. I have walked the palace grounds for hours, sat in the chapel seeking guidance, even ridden out into the countryside trying to escape the knowledge that my entire life has been built on a lie. And through it all, one question has haunted me above all others. Who am I? Mara moved closer, but not too close, respecting the distance he clearly needed. You are Alexander, the prince who will be king. That has not changed. The love that King Harold and Queen Margaret had for you was real, regardless of blood. The training you have received, the character you have developed, the man you have become, all of that is authentically yours. Nothing can take that away from you. But I am not royal, Alexander said, turning to face her, his green eyes blazing with intensity. I am the son of a peasant, born of common blood. Every noble in the kingdom who has bowed to me, who has sworn fealty to me, has done so under false pretenses. What right do I have to rule over them when I am no better than the lowest farmer tilling his fields? You have the right that was given to you by the king who raised you and by your own merit, Mara insisted, her voice stronger now, fierce with a mother's protective instinct even though she had no real claim to that role. Birth is an accident of circumstance, Alexander. It does not determine worth or capability. You said yourself that you remember Queen Margaret's love. That love shaped you. The king's guidance shaped you. And perhaps, just perhaps, something of me shaped you too. Something that existed in you from the moment you were born. A resilience and compassion that comes from understanding struggle. Alexander's expression softened slightly, and he studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. I see myself in you, he admitted quietly. The eyes, yes, but more than that. The way you hold yourself, the way you speak. There is a strength there that I recognize. Something familiar, even though we are strangers. It frightens me, how much I want to reject this connection, and how impossible it is to deny it at the same time. I do not expect you to accept me as your mother, Mara said, her voice breaking slightly. I know I have no right to that title. I did not raise you, did not comfort you when you were hurt, or celebrate your triumphs. I was not there for any of it, but I am asking you to believe that I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering what became of the baby who was stolen from me. And now that I know you are alive and well, now that I have seen the remarkable man you have become, I am grateful for that, even if I can never be part of your life beyond this moment. Something in Alexander's face shifted, a crack appearing in the wall he had built around his emotions. He took a step toward her, then another, until they were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of darker green in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he fought for control. I do not know how to feel about you, he confessed, his voice raw with honesty. Part of me wants to rage at you for disrupting my life, even though I know rationally that none of this is your fault. Another part of me wants to know everything about you, wants to understand where I came from and what it means. And underneath all of that is this strange ache, this feeling of something missing that I did not know existed until now. Tears streamed down Mara's face, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. I feel it too, she whispered. That ache. I have felt it every day for 17 years, a hollow place in my heart that nothing could fill. And now you are here, standing before me, and I do not know how to bridge the distance between who we are and who we might have been. Alexander reached out tentatively and touched her face, his fingers gentle as they caught her tears. It was the first physical contact between them, and Mara felt it like a shock through her entire body, a recognition that went deeper than rational thought. This was her child, her son, and no amount of time or distance could completely erase that bond. Alexander seemed to feel it too, his hand trembling slightly before he pulled it back, as if the connection was too intense to maintain. I need time, he said, stepping back to put distance between them again. Time to process all of this, to decide what it means for my future and for the kingdom. The king grows weaker every day, and soon I will have to take the throne. When I do, I will be expected to address the conspiracy that led to this situation, to bring Duke Ravencrest to justice for his crimes. That will require all of my strength and focus. But after that is done, perhaps we can talk again, can try to find some kind of relationship that makes sense for both of us. I understand, Mara said, though her heart ached at the thought of more waiting, More distance. Take all the time you need, Alexander. I will be here when you are ready. Alexander nodded and moved toward the door. But before he could leave, it opened to reveal Garrett, who stopped short when he saw the prince. The two men regarded each other for a long moment, and Mara sensed some unspoken communication passing between them, the kind of understanding that came from years of friendship and mutual respect. Captain Blackwood, Alexander said formally, I trust you have been seeing to Mistress Thornley's comfort during her stay at the palace. I have, Your Highness, Garrett replied, equally formal, though his eyes held warmth when they flickered to Mara. She has been treated with all the courtesy due to an honored guest of the king. Good, Alexander said. See that it continues. And Garrett, thank you for bringing her here. I know you were following the king's orders, but I also know this cannot have been an easy task for you. Your loyalty and discretion are appreciated, as always. After Alexander left, Garrett entered the room and closed the door, immediately moving to where Mara stood, still shaking from the emotional encounter. He did not ask permission before pulling her into his arms, simply held her as she wept against his chest, his hand stroking her hair with soothing motions that gradually calmed her trembling. He came to see you, Garrett said softly when her tears finally subsided. That is a good sign, Mara. It means he is trying to understand, trying to find a way forward. Alexander is not a man who runs from difficult truths, even when those truths shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. He is so angry, Mara murmured, not pulling away from Garrett's embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. Not at me specifically, but at the situation, at the lies and the deception. I do not know if he will ever truly accept me, if we will ever have any real connection beyond this moment of crisis. Give him time, Garrett advised, echoing Alexander's own words. The prince I know is capable of great compassion and understanding. Once the initial shock passes, once he has had time to grieve for the life he thought he had, I believe he will come to appreciate the truth of his heritage and the woman who gave him life. Mara pulled back slightly so she could look up at Garrett's face, seeing the concern and care written plainly in his features. Over the past week, something had shifted between them, a deepening of the connection that had begun during their journey to the capital. She had come to depend on him, to look forward to his visits, to feel a warmth in his presence that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth and everything to do with the man himself. What will happen to me when all of this is resolved? She asked, voicing a fear that had been growing in her mind. When the king passes and Alexander takes the throne, when Duke Ravencrest is brought to justice and the conspiracy is exposed, I cannot stay here in the palace forever, living in these fine rooms and wearing expensive dresses. I do not belong in this world, Garrett. I never will. You belong wherever you choose to be, Garrett said firmly, his hands moving to cup her face, tilting it up so she had no choice but to meet his eyes. And perhaps, if you were willing, you might choose to remain here, not as a curiosity or a reminder of scandal, but as someone valued in her own right. The palace always needs people of character and integrity, and you possess both in abundance. As what? Mara asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. A servant? I have no skills that would be useful here. I can weave cloth, yes, but the palace has dozens of weavers far more skilled than I could ever be. I can read and write a little, but hardly at the level required for any position of importance. What place is there for a peasant woman who happens to be the mother of the future king? As my wife, Garrett said quietly, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Mara thought she understood about her situation. She stared at him, certain she had misheard, that exhaustion and emotion had made her imagine words that could not possibly have been spoken. What did you say? I said, as my wife, Garrett repeated, his voice steady and sure, despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know this is sudden, that we have known each other for barely more than a week. I know that you are dealing with more than any person should have to bear. But Mara, from the moment I met you in that cottage in Thornwick, I have been drawn to you. Your strength in the face of loss, your dignity, despite the hardships you have endured, your capacity for love even when life has given you every reason to close your heart. These past days, getting to know you, watching you navigate this impossible situation with such grace, I have come to realize that what I feel is more than admiration or respect. I believe I am falling in love with you. Mara's legs felt weak, and she had to grip Garrett's arms to steady herself. You cannot possibly mean this. I am nobody, Garrett. You are a captain in the royal guard, educated, respected, from a noble family. You could have any woman at court. Why would you want to saddle yourself with a peasant, especially one whose life is so complicated? Because those complications do not matter to me, Garrett insisted, his hand still cradling her face with infinite gentleness. Because when I imagine my future, I see you in it. Because when you smile, truly smile, it feels like the sun breaking through clouds. Because you make me want to be a better man, to live up to the image I see reflected in your eyes. I am not asking you to answer me now, not when everything is still so uncertain, but I wanted you to know how I feel, wanted you to understand that you have options, that your future does not have to be defined by returning to poverty and obscurity. I do not know what to say, Mara admitted, her heart racing with a combination of fear and hope. You honor me with your offer, more than I can express, but I need to think about this, need to understand what it would mean. I do not want to accept out of desperation or fear of the alternative. If I were to marry you, I would want it to be because I feel the same way you do, because I can offer you the kind of love you deserve. That is all I ask, Garrett said, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Take your time. Think about what you want, what would make you happy. Whatever you decide, I will respect your choice. But know that my feelings are genuine, and my offer stands regardless of how long it takes you to decide. The days that followed were a blur of activity and emotion. King Harold's condition deteriorated rapidly, and the palace was thrown into organized chaos as preparations were made for the transition of power. Mara saw little of Alexander during this time, as the prince was constantly at his father's bedside or meeting with advisors to prepare for his coronation. Garrett was equally busy, coordinating security arrangements and ensuring that the various noble families arriving for the ceremonies were properly accommodated. But despite their busy schedules, Garrett found time to visit Mara every evening, bringing her news of the day's events and slowly, gently, courting her with a patience and respect that wore down her defenses more effectively than any grand gesture could have. He brought her flowers from the palace gardens, books from the library that he thought she might enjoy, and once a new shawl in a shade of green that matched her eyes. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, discovering the 1,000 small things that made each of them unique. Mara found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the information Garrett brought and everything to do with the man himself. She noticed things about him that made her heart beat faster, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the strength in his hands that could nevertheless be so gentle, the intelligence and humor that made every conversation feel effortless. She caught herself imagining what it would be like to wake beside him every morning, to have the right to touch him freely, to build a life together beyond the current crisis. King Harold died on a cold morning when frost covered the palace gardens like a blanket of diamonds, transforming the world into something both beautiful and sorrowful. Mara heard the bells begin to toll before dawn, their deep resonant tones echoing across the capital, announcing to all within hearing that the king had passed from this world to the next. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, watching as lights appeared throughout the palace and the city beyond, people stirring to acknowledge the end of an era and the beginning of another. Within hours, the palace was draped in black cloth, and servants moved through the corridors with red-rimmed eyes, whispering prayers for the departed king's soul. Mara dressed carefully in one of the darker gowns Garrett had arranged for her, a deep gray wool with black trim, and waited in her chambers, uncertain of what her role should be in the mourning process. She had barely known King Harold, had spoken with him only once, yet his death felt profoundly personal because of the connection he represented to her son. Garrett came to her chambers mid-morning, his face drawn with grief and exhaustion. He wore full ceremonial armor, polished to a mirror shine, with a black sash across his chest signifying mourning. Even in his sorrow, he was magnificent to look at, and Mara felt her heart ache with affection for this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. "Alexander is taking it hard," Garrett said without preamble, accepting the cup of wine Mara poured for him and draining it in one long swallow. He was with the king when he passed, holding his hand. Harold's last words were to make Alexander promise to rule with justice and compassion, to never forget that a king's first duty is to his people, regardless of their station. And then he looked at me and made me promise to protect Alexander, not just his life, but his heart, to help him navigate the difficult days ahead. "Will there be a long mourning period before the coronation?" Mara asked, settling into the chair across from Garrett. "No," Garrett replied, setting down his empty cup. "The kingdom cannot be without a crowned monarch for long. There are too many who would see that as an opportunity to seize power. The coronation will take place in 3 days, immediately following the king's funeral. It is rushed, uncomfortably so, but necessary. And it means that Alexander must deal with his grief while simultaneously preparing to take on the weight of an entire kingdom." "Can I help him in any way?" Mara asked, though she doubted there was anything a peasant woman could do to ease a prince's burden. "Your presence helps more than you know," Garrett assured her. "Alexander has asked about you several times, wanted to know if you were being cared for properly. I think knowing you are here, that he has not lost everyone connected to his true origins, provides him with a strange kind of comfort, even if he is not ready to fully embrace that connection yet." The funeral was held the following day in the great cathedral that dominated the center of the capital, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if trying to bridge the gap between earth and the divine. Mara attended, positioned in a section reserved for lesser nobility and important guests, far from where Alexander stood at the front of the cathedral beside the king's coffin. She could see him from her position, though, could see the rigid set of his shoulders beneath the black cloak he wore, the way he held himself with such control that she knew he must be fracturing inside. The ceremony was elaborate and lengthy, with prayers and hymns that spoke of the king's virtues and accomplishments. Various nobles came forward to offer eulogies, praising King Harold's wisdom, his strength in battle, his fair judgments. Through it all, Alexander remained motionless, his face a mask of composure that only someone who knew to look for the cracks would recognize as being held together by sheer force of will. When the ceremony finally concluded, and the king's body was borne from the cathedral to be interred in the royal crypts, the crowd began to disperse. Mara made her way slowly toward the exit, caught in the press of bodies, when she felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Alexander standing beside her, having somehow made his way through the throng to reach her. "Walk with me," he said quietly, and though it was phrased as a request, there was an urgency to it that made it nearly a command. They walked through the palace gardens in silence, Alexander having dismissed the guards who tried to follow them with a sharp gesture. The autumn air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant smoke from the city's hearth fires. They walked until they reached a secluded corner of the garden where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches nearly bare of leaves. Alexander sat heavily on the bench, and after a moment's hesitation, Mara sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. For long minutes, he simply stared at his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "He was the only father I ever knew," Alexander said. "Even knowing now that we shared no blood, that does not change the fact that he raised me, taught me, loved me as his own son. And his last words to me were about duty, about being a good king. Even on his deathbed, he was preparing me for what comes next. How do I honor that? How do I rule justly when my entire claim to the throne is built on a lie? By being exactly the man he raised you to be," Mara said gently. "By remembering that leadership is not about bloodlines but about character. King Harold saw that in you, Alexander. He knew the truth of your birth for weeks before he died, and yet he never questioned your right to rule. That should tell you something about what he believed you were capable of." Alexander turned to look at her, his green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I am afraid," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him dearly. "Afraid that I will fail, that I will not be strong enough or wise enough for what is required of me. Afraid that when the truth of my origins becomes known, the nobility will refuse to follow me. Afraid that I will prove Duke Ravencrest right in his assessment that a peasant's son has no business on the throne. Then let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Mara said, turning to face him fully. "I see a man who grieves genuinely for the father who raised him, who takes his responsibilities seriously, who cares about the welfare of others, even when his own world is falling apart. I see strength and compassion, intelligence and humility. These are the qualities of a good king, Alexander, and they have nothing to do with whether your blood is royal or common." Something in Alexander's expression cracked, and suddenly he was leaning forward, his head dropping to rest against Mara's shoulder as the tears he had been holding back finally fell. She froze for a moment, uncertain, and then instinct took over. She wrapped her arms around him, this man who was both her son and a stranger, and held him as he wept, offering the comfort that had been denied to both of them for 17 years. They stayed that way for a long time, the prince and the peasant woman, connected by blood and circumstances beyond their control, finding in that moment a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated them. When Alexander finally pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, he looked almost embarrassed by his display of emotion. "I apologize," he began, but Mara cut him off. "Never apologize for being human, for feeling deeply. That capacity for emotion is part of what will make you a great king, Alexander. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. I want to know about you," Alexander said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "About your life, about the man who was my father. I want to understand where I came from, what my life might have been like if the conspiracy had never happened. Will you tell me?" And so Mara told him. She spoke of her childhood in a different village, of her mother who had been kind and loving until illness took her too soon. She told him about her father Thomas, whose mind was failing, but whose heart remained gentle. She described the merchant's son who had courted her with pretty words and empty promises, who had disappeared when faced with the consequences of their actions. She spoke honestly about the shame and hardship she had faced as an unwed mother, about the night her baby was taken, and the years of grief that followed. Alexander listened intently, asking questions occasionally, his expression growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. "The man who fathered me," he said when she finished. "Do you know what became of him? I heard years later that he married a merchant's daughter in another town, that he went on to have a prosperous life." Mara replied, "I do not hate him anymore, though I did for a long time. He was young and foolish and afraid, and he made the selfish choice. But his cowardice inadvertently gave you the chance to become who you are now. Perhaps there is some purpose in that. Do you regret it?" Alexander asked quietly. "Knowing what you know now, do you regret the path your life took, the suffering you endured?" Mara was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret the loss," she said finally. "I regret the years we did not have together, the moments I missed of your childhood. But I cannot regret the journey that brought me here, to this moment, because it led to me knowing that my son survived and thrived. And it brought me to understand that sometimes what we think of as tragedy can contain seeds of something meaningful, even beautiful." The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation for the coronation. The palace was transformed, black mourning cloths replaced by banners of royal blue and gold. Nobles from across the kingdom gathered, along with representatives from neighboring lands, all coming to witness the crowning of the new king. Mara observed it all from a distance, feeling more than ever like an outsider in this world of pageantry and politics. But on the evening before the coronation, as she was preparing for bed, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found not Garrett, but a palace servant bearing a message written on fine parchment in Alexander's own hand. The note was brief but significant. "Please stand with the royal household tomorrow during the coronation. I would have you there, as a witness to what you helped make possible. You have more right to be present than many who will attend. Alexander." Mara read the note 3 times, her hands trembling. This was not just an invitation to attend a ceremony. This was Alexander's way of acknowledging her publicly, of signaling that she had a place in his life, even if the exact nature of that place remained undefined. She pressed the parchment to her chest, overwhelmed with gratitude and hope that perhaps, eventually, they might find their way to something resembling a true mother-son relationship. The coronation itself was magnificent and overwhelming in equal measure. The cathedral was packed with nobility in their finest garments, leather and wool in rich colors, decorated with embroidery and fur, cinched with elaborate belts and clasped with precious brooches. Mara wore a gown that Garrett had insisted she accept, deep blue silk with silver threading that caught the light from hundreds of candles, with a cloak of gray fur that marked her as someone of importance, even if no one quite knew who she was. She stood in the section reserved for the royal household, which consisted of advisors, distant relatives, and trusted retainers. Lord Chancellor Pembroke stood beside her, having positioned himself there deliberately to deflect questions about her presence. Garrett was on duty near the altar, part of the honor guard surrounding Alexander, resplendent in ceremonial armor that gleamed in the candlelight. The ceremony began with prayers and blessings, the archbishop calling upon divine favor for the new king. Then Alexander entered, walking down the center aisle with measured steps, wearing robes of deep burgundy velvet lined with ermine fur, his dark hair falling to his shoulders, his handsome face composed but showing the weight of what this moment meant. When he reached the altar and knelt before the archbishop, the entire cathedral seemed to hold its breath. The crown was heavy gold, worked with intricate designs and set with precious stones that had been worn by English kings for generations. As it was placed upon Alexander's head, as the words of coronation were spoken, Mara felt tears streaming down her face. This was her son, the baby stolen from her arms, now being crowned King of England. The impossibility of it, the strange twisting of fate that had brought them to this moment, overwhelmed her completely. When Alexander rose and turned to face his people, when the cathedral erupted in cheers and the bells began to toll in celebration, his eyes found hers across the crowded space. For just a moment their gazes locked, and she saw in his expression a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the father he had lost, uncertainty about the future, but also gratitude and perhaps the beginning of acceptance. He inclined his head to her slightly, a gesture so small that most would miss it, but that Mara understood as the acknowledgement it was meant to be. The first week of King Alexander's reign was consumed with the business of transition, endless meetings with advisors and nobles seeking to curry favor with the new monarch. But beneath the surface of these mundane activities, preparations were being made for something far more significant: the confrontation with Duke Ravencrest and the exposure of the conspiracy that had shaped the course of the kingdom for 17 years. Mara saw little of Alexander during this time, though she knew from Garrett that the young king was working tirelessly with Lord Chancellor Pembroke to build an ironclad case against the Duke. The evidence collected by the late King Harold was extensive: Dr. Aldrich's detailed confession, financial records showing payments from Ravencrest to the physician, correspondence between the Duke and other conspirators, and testimony from servants who had witnessed suspicious activities on the night of the substitution. "It must be handled carefully," Garrett explained to Mara one evening as they sat together in her chambers, the fire crackling in the hearth. He had fallen into the habit of spending his evenings with her when his duties allowed, and Mara had come to treasure these quiet moments of companionship. "Duke Ravencrest commands significant loyalty among certain factions of the nobility. If Alexander moves against him without overwhelming proof, it could split the kingdom and lead to civil war. Every piece of evidence must be presented systematically, every witness credible beyond question." "And what of my role in all this?" Mara asked, setting aside the embroidery she had been working on, a skill she had taken up to occupy her hands during the long days. "Will I be called upon to testify? To stand before the court and tell my story?" "Almost certainly," Garrett replied, reaching across to take her hand in his. The gesture had become natural between them, this casual touching that spoke of growing intimacy and affection. "Your testimony will be crucial in establishing the human cost of Ravencrest's actions. It is one thing to speak of conspiracy in abstract terms, but quite another to hear a mother describe the pain of having her child stolen. Alexander wants the court to understand the full magnitude of what was done." Mara felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I am not accustomed to speaking before crowds, especially not crowds of nobles who will judge every word I say. What if I fail? What if my testimony is not compelling enough to sway them?" "You need only tell the truth," Garrett assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "Speak from your heart, as you did when you told me your story during our journey here. There is power in honesty, Mara, and your honesty will be more convincing than any practiced oration could be." He paused, his expression growing more serious, and Mara knew from experience that he had something important to say. Over the weeks they had known each other, she had learned to read his moods, to understand the small tells that indicated when he was troubled or excited or, as now, working up the courage to broach a difficult subject. "What is it?" she prompted gently. "You have something on your mind." "I have been thinking about my proposal," Garrett said, his blue eyes fixed intently on her face. "I know I asked you to take your time, to be certain of your feelings before giving me an answer. But with everything that is about to happen, with the trial and its aftermath, I find myself wanting to know where we stand. Not because I wish to pressure you, but because I need to understand how to best support you through what is coming." Mara's heart began to race, and she realized with sudden clarity that she had already made her decision. had perhaps made it days ago without fully acknowledging it to herself. The thought of returning to her old life, to the poverty and loneliness of Thornwick, held no appeal when weighed against the possibility of building a future with this remarkable man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "I have been afraid," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Afraid that what I feel for you is born of gratitude or dependence, that it is not real love but simply relief at having someone strong to lean on during a difficult time. But I have examined my heart carefully, Garrett, and what I feel goes far deeper than gratitude. When I see you, my spirit lifts. When you are near, I feel safe in a way I have not felt since I was a child in my mother's arms. When I imagine my future, I cannot picture it without you in it. So yes, if your offer still stands, I would be honored to become your wife." The joy that flooded Garrett's face was beautiful to witness, transforming his serious features into something radiant. He stood abruptly, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, holding her close against his chest where she could hear the rapid beating of his heart. When he pulled back slightly and lowered his head to kiss her, Mara felt as though the world had suddenly expanded, becoming full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though Garrett feared she might change her mind or pull away. But when Mara responded, her arms winding around his neck and her lips parting beneath his, the kiss deepened into something more passionate, more promising. It spoke of desire, certainly, but also of commitment and trust, of two people choosing each other despite the chaos surrounding them and the uncertainty of what the future might bring. "I want to do this properly," Garrett said when they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless. "I want to ask King Alexander for his blessing, to have a ceremony that honors you as you deserve to be honored. You have spent too much of your life in shadows, Mara. I want our marriage to be celebrated openly, a declaration to the world that I am proud to call you my wife." "Alexander may not approve," Mara cautioned, though her heart soared at Garrett's words. "I am still essentially a stranger to him, and one whose presence complicates his life considerably. He may not wish to give his blessing to a union between his mother and his most trusted guard." "Then I will convince him," Garrett said with the confidence of a man who knew his own worth and his place in Alexander's affections. "The king values loyalty and genuine feeling above social convention. When he understands that what we have is real, that we are not acting impulsively but with full awareness of what we are choosing, I believe he will support us." The opportunity to broach the subject with Alexander came sooner than expected. The following morning, Mara received a summons to the king's private study, a chamber she had never entered before. Her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, she made her way through the palace corridors, escorted by a young guard who treated her with careful respect, clearly having been instructed that she was someone of importance. The study was smaller and more intimate than she had expected, lined with shelves full of books and maps, with a large desk positioned near windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Alexander stood when she entered, gesturing for her to take one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace while he settled into the one opposite. He wore simpler clothing than his formal court attire, just leather breeches and a tunic of deep green that brought out the color of his eyes, and he looked tired, as though he had been working through the night. "Thank you for coming," Alexander said, his tone formal but not cold. "I wanted to speak with you before the trial begins. Lord Pembroke believes we are ready to move against Duke Ravencrest within the next few days, and I need to prepare you for what that will entail." "Captain Blackwood has explained that I will likely be called to testify," Mara replied, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to see justice done. It will not be easy," Alexander warned, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. "Ravencrest is a cunning man, and he will attempt to discredit you, to paint you as an opportunist seeking to profit from a fabricated story. He will likely make reference to your past, to the circumstances of my birth, in ways designed to shame and humiliate you. You must be prepared for that, must be strong enough to withstand his attacks without faltering." "I have lived with shame for 17 years, Mara said quietly. "I have been called every vile name imaginable, been accused of crimes I did not commit, been treated as less than human because I bore a child outside of marriage. Whatever Duke Ravencrest says to me cannot be worse than what I have already endured. And this time, I will have truth on my side, which is more than I had before." Alexander's expression softened slightly, and he nodded with what might have been approval. "You are stronger than you appear, I think. That is good. You will need that strength in the days ahead." He paused, then continued in a different tone, less formal and more personal. "I have been thinking a great deal about what you said in the garden after my father's funeral, about how my capacity for emotion could be a strength rather than a weakness. I have spent my whole life being told that kings must be above such things, that showing feeling is a sign of vulnerability that enemies will exploit. And yet King Harold showed you love," Mara pointed out gently. "He was not ashamed to care for you deeply, to let that love shape his decisions regarding your future. Did that make him a weak king?" "No," Alexander admitted. "It made him a better one, I think. More compassionate in his judgments, more willing to consider the human cost of his policies." He was quiet for a moment, then met her eyes directly. "I want you to know that I am trying to accept the truth of my birth, trying to reconcile the man I thought I was with the reality of who I am. It is not easy, and there are moments when I still want to reject it all, to pretend that none of this is real. But I am trying, and your presence here helps somehow. It gives me a connection to something authentic, something that cannot be taken away by political machinations or noble intrigue." "That means more to me than you can possibly know," Mara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not expect you to call me Mother, Alexander. I have not earned that title. But perhaps in time, we can find our way to some kind of relationship that honors what we are to each other, while respecting the life you have lived and the man you have become. I would like that," Alexander said simply. And in those words, Mara heard the beginning of healing, the first tentative steps toward a connection that might one day become something real and sustaining. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door, and Garrett entered at Alexander's call. The captain bowed respectfully to the king, then glanced at Mara with barely concealed warmth in his expression. Alexander noticed the look, his eyebrows rising slightly in understanding. "Captain Blackwood," Alexander said, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "I had not expected to see you until this afternoon's council meeting. Is there something urgent that requires my attention?" "Actually, Your Majesty, there is a personal matter I wish to discuss with you," Garrett replied, his military bearing not quite hiding his nervousness. "A matter that concerns both you and Mistress Thornley, and for which I seek your blessing and approval." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to one of keen interest. "I see. Well, Captain, you have served me faithfully for many years, and I value your counsel above that of almost anyone else in this kingdom. Whatever you wish to ask, you may ask it freely." Garrett drew a deep breath, then spoke with the directness of a soldier accustomed to plain speaking. "Your Majesty, I have asked Mistress Thornley to become my wife, and she has honored me by accepting. I am requesting your permission to marry her, with your blessing and support. I understand that the timing may seem inappropriate given everything that is happening, but my feelings are genuine and my intentions honorable. I love her, and I wish to spend my life with her, if you will allow it." For a long moment Alexander said nothing, his green eyes moving between Garrett and Mara with an expression that was difficult to read. Mara felt her heart sink, certain that he was about to refuse, that he would see this as another complication in an already impossibly complex situation. But then slowly, a smile began to spread across Alexander's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their reunion. "You wish to marry my mother," Alexander said, and though the word mother came out somewhat awkwardly, as though he was testing how it felt to say it, there was no mockery in his tone. "My most trusted friend and advisor wishes to marry the woman who gave me life. I confess I did not see this development coming, though perhaps I should have. You have been spending considerable time together, and I have noticed how you look at each other when you think no one is watching." "Does that mean you approve, Your Majesty?" Garrett asked, hope evident in his voice. "It means I think you are both fortunate to have found each other," Alexander replied. "And yes, Captain, you have my blessing and my wholehearted support. If anything, this solves a problem I have been wrestling with. What to do about Mistress Thornley's position here once the immediate crisis is resolved. As your wife, she will have a clear and respected place at court, and I will not have to worry about her welfare or protection. It is, in many ways, an ideal solution." He stood and moved to where Garrett stood at attention, clasping the captain's shoulder in a gesture of friendship and approval. "You have my permission to marry, Garrett. And more than that, You have my gratitude for caring for her when I was not yet ready to do so myself. Treat her well, or you will answer to me not as your king, but as her son." The words were said with warmth and humor, but there was an underlying seriousness to them that showed how much Alexander had already come to value Mara's presence in his life, even if he was still learning how to express it. Mara felt tears spring to her eyes once again, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit this young man was showing despite his own pain and uncertainty. The great hall of the palace had been transformed into a court of judgment, its vast space filled with nobles, advisors, and witnesses gathered to observe what would undoubtedly be the most significant trial of the new king's reign. Banners hung from the high ceiling and guards lined the walls, their presence a reminder that this was not merely a legal proceeding, but a matter of national importance. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais, sat King Alexander on his throne, wearing the crown and robes of state, his expression grave and composed despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Mara sat in a section reserved for key witnesses, with Garrett standing nearby as part of the king's honor guard. She wore a gown of deep burgundy wool with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs, a gift from Alexander himself that he had sent to her chambers the night before, with a note that simply read, "Wear this tomorrow. Stand tall. You represent not just yourself, but all those who have suffered injustice. Make them see your strength." The dress was finer than anything she had ever owned, and wearing it gave her courage, a tangible reminder that she was no longer the powerless peasant woman whose child had been stolen, but someone whose voice mattered, whose truth would be heard. Duke Ravencrest stood in the center of the hall, flanked by guards, his hands bound in iron shackles. He was a tall man in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and sharp features that spoke of aristocratic breeding. Even in chains, he carried himself with arrogance, his chin lifted defiantly as he surveyed the assembled crowd with contempt. He wore fine clothing beneath a dark cloak, his leather jerkin worked with his family crest, and everything about his demeanor suggested a man who believed himself above the law and untouchable by common justice. Lord Chancellor Pembroke stood and called the court to order, his voice resonating through the vast space. "We are gathered here today to hear evidence and testimony regarding crimes of the highest magnitude committed against the crown, against the late King Harold, and against the people of this kingdom. Duke Edmund Ravencrest stands accused of conspiracy, treason, abduction, bribery of royal officials, and numerous other offenses. The evidence will show that the Duke orchestrated a plot to undermine the rightful succession by arranging for the substitution of the Queen's stillborn child with a healthy infant stolen from a peasant woman, with the intention of later revealing this deception to throw the kingdom into chaos and seize power for himself." The hall erupted in whispers and gasps, though many present had already heard rumors of the accusations. Ravencrest's expression did not change, his features remaining fixed in an arrogant sneer that suggested he viewed the proceedings as beneath his dignity. "These are grave charges," Pembroke continued, "and they require grave evidence. We shall present that evidence systematically, beginning with the confession of the late Dr. Aldrich, physician to the royal household, who on his deathbed admitted his role in the conspiracy and named Duke Ravencrest as the architect of the plot. Over the next several hours, witness after witness was called to testify. Servants who had seen Ravencrest meeting secretly with Dr. Aldrich in the months before Prince Alexander's birth, financial clerks who produced records showing large sums of money transferred from the Duke's accounts to the physician, members of Ravencrest's own household who, granted immunity in exchange for their testimony, described conversations in which the Duke had spoken openly of his plans to discredit the monarchy and position himself as the kingdom's savior when chaos inevitably ensued. Throughout it all, Ravencrest remained silent, his expression one of disdain, though Mara noticed his hands clenching and unclenching within their shackles, a sign that beneath his composed exterior, he was not as confident as he appeared. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the hall, Lord Pembroke called Mara's name. "The court calls Mistress Mara Thornley to give testimony." Mara rose on trembling legs, acutely aware of every eye in the hall turning toward her. She walked slowly to the center of the space, stopping at the designated spot and turning to face King Alexander on his throne. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his gaze both encouragement and something that might have been pride. She drew strength from that look, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin, determined not to let fear silence her voice. "Mistress Thornley," Pembroke began gently, "please tell the court about the events of 17 years ago, specifically the night of your son's birth." Mara took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice quiet at first, but growing stronger as she continued. She described the night she had given birth, alone except for the midwife who had helped her, in a small cottage far from the prying eyes of judgmental villagers. She spoke of the joy she had felt despite her circumstances, the overwhelming love that had filled her when she first held her baby boy, the way his tiny fingers had wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength. "He had green eyes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "Even as a newborn, I could see that his eyes would be green, like mine. I placed a silver pendant around his neck, a family heirloom that had belonged to my mother and her mother before her. It was all I had to give him, all I could offer as protection and blessing. And then I slept, exhausted from the labor, and when I woke in the morning, he was gone. The cradle was empty, the pendant gone with him. My baby had vanished as though he had never existed." The hall was completely silent now, every person present hanging on her words. Even Ravencrest's arrogant expression had faltered slightly, though he quickly masked it. "I searched everywhere," Mara continued, tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to hide. "I questioned everyone in the village, reported the disappearance to the local lord's men, but no one had seen anything, no one knew what had happened. Some accused me of killing my own child and hiding the body. Others suggested I had sold him to traveling merchants. The truth, that he had simply disappeared, was too strange for most to accept. Eventually the accusations and whispers became too much, and I left that village, moved to Thornwick, and tried to build a new life. But I never forgot him, never stopped wondering what had become of my baby, never stopped grieving for what was stolen from me." Pembroke approached her, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Do you recognize this object, Mistress Thornley?" He unwrapped the cloth to reveal the silver crescent moon pendant, and Mara felt her breath catch in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch it. "That is my mother's pendant, the one I placed around my baby's neck. Where did you find it?" "It was discovered among Prince Alexander's personal belongings," Pembroke replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Hidden in a small box that he has kept since childhood, a treasured possession whose origins he could not explain. The pendant proves the connection between you and the king, confirms that the baby stolen from you 17 years ago and the man now sitting on the throne of England are one and the same." Duke Ravencrest finally spoke, his voice dripping with contempt. "This proves nothing except that a clever peasant woman has concocted an elaborate story to gain power and influence. That pendant could have been acquired anywhere, planted among the prince's belongings to support this fabrication. Are we truly expected to believe that a peasant's bastard has been raised as our future king? The entire notion is absurd, an insult to the dignity of the crown and the nobility of this realm." "You speak of dignity and nobility," Alexander's voice rang out, silencing the whispers that had begun to rise again. "Yet it was you who orchestrated the theft of an infant from his mother's arms, you who bribed a physician to commit an act of unspeakable cruelty. You who intended to use that crime to destabilize the kingdom and seize power for yourself. If we are to speak of insults to dignity, Duke Ravencrest, we need look no further than your own actions." The king stood, descending from the dais with measured steps, his crown catching the light as he moved. He stopped directly in front of Ravencrest, and though the duke was taller by several inches, there was no question who held the true power in that moment. "I have heard all the evidence," Alexander continued, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "I have examined Dr. Aldrich's confession, reviewed the financial records, listened to the testimony of witnesses. The case against you is overwhelming and irrefutable. But beyond all of that legal evidence, there is something more fundamental at stake here. You believe that common blood makes a person less worthy of respect, less deserving of justice and compassion. You built your entire conspiracy on the assumption that revealing my true origins would destroy me, would make the nobility reject me as unfit to rule." Alexander turned to address the assembled nobles, his voice growing stronger, more passionate. "But I stand before you now, knowing the truth of my birth, and I am not ashamed. Yes, I am the son of a peasant woman. Yes, I was born outside the traditional lines of succession. But I was raised by a king who taught me honor and duty. I was educated by the finest scholars, trained by the most skilled warriors. I have dedicated my life to understanding what it means to serve this kingdom and its people. Does my common blood negate any of that? Does it make me less capable of ruling justly? The hall remained silent, nobles exchanging glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to such a direct challenge to their fundamental assumptions about bloodlines and legitimacy. "I say it does not," Alexander declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "In fact, I believe it gives me something that purely royal blood could never provide, an understanding of what life is like for the vast majority of people in this kingdom. I carry within me the blood of those who work the land, who struggle to survive, who face hardship and injustice daily. That connection, that knowledge, will make me a better king than I could ever have been if I had remained ignorant of my true heritage." He turned back to Ravencrest, his expression hardening. "You sought to use my origins as a weapon to destroy me and seize power. Instead, you have given me the greatest gift possible, the truth of who I am and where I came from. For that, ironically, I almost thank you. But your crimes cannot go unpunished. You stole a child from his mother. You corrupted a royal physician. You conspired against the crown. You planned to plunge this kingdom into civil war for your own ambition. These are crimes that demand the harshest penalty." "What say you, Duke Edmund Ravencrest?" Lord Chancellor Pembroke asked formally. "How do you answer these charges?" For the first time, Ravencrest's composure cracked completely. His face flushed with rage, and he lunged forward against the guards holding him, spitting his words with venom. "You are not fit to judge me, bastard king. You are nothing but a peasant's whelp, dressed up in fine clothes and given a crown you have no right to wear. When the other kingdoms learn of this deception, they will descend upon England like wolves, tearing apart a realm too weak and foolish to maintain the purity of its bloodlines." "Silence," Alexander commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "You have been given every opportunity to defend yourself, to present evidence contradicting the charges. Instead, you choose to hurl insults and threats. Very well. I find you guilty of all charges brought against you. The penalty for treason is death, but I will show you a mercy you did not show to the infant you had stolen, or to the woman you caused to suffer. Your life will be spared, but you will spend the remainder of your days imprisoned in the tower, stripped of your titles, your lands forfeit to the crown. Your family name will be stricken from the rolls of nobility, and your descendants will bear the shame of your crimes for generations to come." Guards stepped forward to drag Ravencrest from the hall, and as he was removed, still shouting curses and threats, the assembled nobles began to murmur among themselves. Alexander raised his hand for silence, and the hall quieted once more. "I know that many of you are troubled by what you have learned today," the king said, his tone softening slightly. "You have questions about the legitimacy of my rule, concerns about what this revelation means for the kingdom. I understand those concerns, and I will address them openly and honestly. But first, I wish to acknowledge the woman whose courage made this day possible." He gestured for Mara to approach, and she moved forward on shaking legs, hardly able to believe what was happening. When she reached Alexander, he took her hand in his, a gesture of connection and acceptance that sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the crowd. "This is Mara Thornley, my mother," Alexander said, and though his voice wavered slightly on the word mother, he spoke it clearly and without shame. "She has suffered terribly because of Duke Ravencrest's crimes, has lived with grief and loss for 17 years. Today, she stood before you and spoke her truth, despite knowing she would face judgment and skepticism from many of you. That took more courage than any battle I have ever fought, more strength than any test I have ever faced. I am honored to acknowledge her publicly as my mother, and I declare that from this day forward, she will be afforded all the respect and protection due to a member of the royal household." He turned to face Mara directly, his green eyes meeting hers with an intensity of emotion that took her breath away. "I cannot give you back the years we lost," he said softly, though his words carried through the silent hall. "I cannot undo the pain you suffered, or restore the life you might have lived. But I can give you this: my gratitude for your strength, my respect for your courage, and my promise that you will never again face the world alone. You have a place here, in this palace, in this kingdom, and in my life, for as long as you wish to claim it." Mara could not speak through her tears, could only nod as Alexander pulled her into an embrace that 17 years overdue. The hall erupted in applause, some nobles clearly moved by the display, while others clapped merely because protocol demanded it. But Mara did not care about their motivations. In that moment, held in her son's arms, she felt a healing begin that she had never thought possible. When they finally separated, Alexander turned to address the court once more. "There is one final matter I wish to resolve today." Captain Garrett Blackwood stepped forward. Garrett moved from his position with the honor guard, approaching the throne and kneeling in the traditional gesture of fealty. Alexander smiled down at his most trusted friend and advisor. "Captain Blackwood has served this kingdom and my family with unwavering loyalty and dedication for many years," Alexander said. "He was entrusted by my father with the delicate task of finding my mother and bringing her safely to the capital. He has protected her, supported her, and has asked my permission to make her his wife. I have granted that permission gladly, and now I wish to make their union a matter of official recognition." He gestured for Garrett to rise and for Mara to stand beside him. "Within the week they will be married here in the palace chapel, with all the ceremony and celebration befitting such an occasion. Captain Blackwood will be elevated to the rank of Lord Commander of the Royal Guard, and Mistress Thornley, upon their marriage, will become Lady Mara Blackwood, a title that reflects her importance to this court and to me personally." The announcement was met with more applause, though Mara noticed that some of the older nobles looked troubled, clearly uncomfortable with a peasant being elevated to such a position. But Alexander's expression brooked no argument, and his will on this matter was absolute. The trial concluded with formal declarations and the recording of judgments, but for Mara, the rest of the proceedings passed in a blur. She was surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine and others clearly attempting to curry favor by association, until Garrett finally extracted her from the crowd and led her back to her chambers. Once they were alone, she collapsed into his arms, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "It is over," Garrett murmured into her hair, holding her close. "The conspiracy is exposed, Ravencrest is imprisoned, and Alexander has publicly acknowledged you. You are free, Mara. Free from the past, free from shame, free to build whatever future you choose." "I choose you," Mara said, pulling back to look up into his face. "I choose this life, improbable as it is. I choose to marry you, and to stand beside Alexander as whatever kind of mother I can be to him, even if that relationship is still being defined. I choose to stop running from my past, and to embrace the possibility of happiness." Their wedding took place 5 days later in the palace chapel, a beautiful space with stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floor. Mara wore a gown of cream-colored silk with a cloak of blue velvet lined with white fur, and her hair was dressed with small flowers that gave off a delicate fragrance. Garrett stood waiting for her at the altar, magnificent in formal attire, his expression one of such love and devotion that it took her breath away. Alexander performed the ceremony himself, having claimed the right as king to join them in marriage. His voice was strong and sure as he spoke the traditional words, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, when Garrett kissed her with such tenderness that she felt tears spring to her eyes, the chapel erupted in joyous celebration. The feast that followed was a grand affair, with nobles and commoners alike invited to celebrate the union. Music filled the great hall, and dancers whirled across the floor in intricate patterns. Mara sat beside Garrett at the head table with Alexander on her other side, and for the first time in 17 years she felt truly at peace. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Alexander leaned close to speak to her privately. "I have been thinking about the future," he said, "about what kind of king I want to be. I have decided to establish a new law, one that protects the rights of unwed mothers and their children, that ensures no child can be taken from their parent without just cause and proper legal process. It will not undo what happened to you, but perhaps it will prevent such tragedies from happening to others. That would be a wonderful legacy," Mara said, her heart swelling with pride for this remarkable young man. "Your father, King Harold, would be proud of the ruler you are becoming." "I hope so," Alexander replied, "and I hope that my other father, whoever he was, would also be proud, though I suspect I will never know him. But I have you, and I have Garrett, and I have the memory of the parents who raised me. That is more than enough family for any man." As the night deepened and the celebrations continued, Mara looked around at the life she had somehow found herself living. She thought of her father Thomas back in Thornwick, being cared for by neighbors who sent regular reports of his well-being. She thought of the small cottage where she had spent so many years in solitude and grief. She thought of the baby stolen from her arms and the path that theft had set them both upon. And she realized that while she would never forget the pain of those lost years, would never stop wishing she could have raised her son herself, there was also something remarkable in how events had unfolded. Alexander had become a good man, a just king, someone who would rule with wisdom and compassion. He had been given opportunities in education that she could never have provided, had been shaped by experiences both good and difficult into someone capable of leading a kingdom. Her own life, too, had taken a turn she could never have predicted. She had found love with a man who saw her worth regardless of her birth or past. She had been given a place of respect and honor in a world that had previously only offered her scorn and hardship. She had been reunited with her son, and while their relationship was still new and uncertain, it held the promise of something meaningful and sustaining. As Garrett took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, as she moved in his arms to the music that filled the hall, Mara looked up to see Alexander watching them from his place at the head table. He raised his cup in a silent toast, and she saw in his expression not the resentment or rejection she had once feared, but acceptance, gratitude, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of love. The future stretched before them, uncertain and full of challenges, but also rich with possibility. A peasant woman had become a lady, a stolen child had become a king, and a captain of the guard had found a love worth more than all the gold in the royal treasury. It was an improbable story, one that would be told and retold for generations, of how truth and justice had triumphed over conspiracy and deception, and how three people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by tragedy had found their way to something resembling happiness. As the music played and the candles burned low, as the celebration of new beginnings continued into the night, Mara held tight to Garrett's hand and allowed herself to believe that despite everything that had been lost, despite all the years of pain and separation, the story had somehow found its way to the ending it was always meant to have. Not perfect, perhaps, but real and true and full of hope for all the days yet to come.